Inside 20 minutes later, a clerk handed me a certified copy of Julian's original unamended birth certificate. Mother, Diane Whitfield. Father, Julian's dad. No mention of Colette anywhere on the original document at all, because there wasn't supposed to be one. Somewhere along the way, Colette hadn't just raised another woman's son. She'd had the record legally amended years later to list herself as his biological mother, quietly, permanently in a filing. I found buried 3 folders deep in an amendment request from when Julian was 7 years old. Walking back to my car, I kept thinking about a locked metal box Colette kept in her closet that she'd always waved off as just old tax stuff. I had a strong feeling now it wasn't tax stuff at all. Diane's family. It turned out I found this part almost by accident, cross-referencing an old newspaper obituary had money. A modest family trust set up for the grandchildren of Diane Whitfield, administered quietly for decades by a bank in Raleigh, sitting mostly untouched, because as far as the trustees knew, Diane had died without any surviving children. She had a surviving child. He just didn't know his own name was on that trust. For almost 2 weeks after that, I didn't do anything with what I had. I'd tell myself I was going to say something that night, and then I'd watch Colette on FaceTime reading our daughter a bedtime story in that same soft voice she'd used on Julian his whole life, and I'd lose my nerve completely. Part of me kept hoping I'd find some detail that made it all make sense, a gentler way, a version where she'd told Julian the truth years ago, and I'd just never heard the story. There wasn't one. I checked. Eventually, I stopped waiting to feel ready because I understood I probably never would, and picked the Sunday before the christening simply because I couldn't stand carrying it through one more family dinner without her knowing I knew. The Sunday before the christening, I sat in my car outside Colette's house for almost 10 minutes. Before I went in the same way I had outside the records office weeks earlier, running through every date one more time to be sure I had it exactly right. I wasn't nervous, not really. I was making sure the story held together the same way I'd want to be sure before I brought a discrepancy to my supervisor. Through the front window, I could see her setting the table for Sunday dinner, humming along to whatever was playing on the kitchen radio. No idea at all that the woman parked outside had spent 3 months quietly turning 31 years of her life into a case file. When I finally walked in, I didn't say a word at first. I set the original birth certificate down on her kitchen table face up right next to the sweet tea pitcher and let it sit there. Colette looked down at it for a long moment. I watched the exact second she understood what she was looking at. Her hand went still on the pitcher she'd been about to pour mid-motion, my glass still empty in front of me. She set the pitcher down without filling it. I didn't ask her to. Family is what you build, I said finally, not just what you're born into. Funny coming from you. She didn't try to deny it. That was almost the worst part. She pulled out a chair and sat down slowly like her legs had just stopped fully working. And after a long silence, she said, "I was 22 when your father-in-law asked me to help with the baby. Diane's family didn't want anything to do with a child born the way Julian was out of wedlock before they'd married. I held that baby for 4 days straight while she was dying in that hospital bed, Maya. 4 days. Nobody else showed up for him. Not her family. Nobody but me." "So you erased her," I said. "For 31 years. Her voice cracked just once right on the word erased. "I didn't erase her on purpose, not at first. I was the only mother he ever knew. Somewhere along the way, saying it out loud got harder, not easier. And then there was money sitting in a trust with her name on it, and I told myself what good would it do to reopen all of that pain for a woman who never once came to see him. She was dying, Colette. She never got the chance to come see him." Colette flinched at that like I'd slapped her, and for a second neither of us said anything at all, just the two of us and her empty glass still sitting where she'd left it. For 1 second, just one, I saw exactly why she'd done it. A scared 22-year-old holding a dying woman's baby, choosing the version of the story that let her keep him, and then spending 3 decades too afraid to ever go back and correct it. And then that second passed, and I was just furious again, sitting at a table I'd eaten 100 Sunday dinners at, looking at a woman who'd let me build a whole marriage inside a lie she could have corrected any year she wanted to. I want to tell you it ended there, clean and simple in that kitchen. It didn't. What ended there was the version of Colette I was willing to protect without asking questions. What came after took a lot longer to sort out, and honestly, some of it is still sorting itself out even now. It wasn't until the week after that I found out how I'd actually gotten access to that sealed obstetrics chart in the first place, which is a piece of this I hadn't told anyone, including myself, to think too hard about. My coworker Nalidi runs our records department, and she's the one who technically approved my access to that decade of archive boxes. Boxes that under normal policy would have required a supervisor sign-off. I never would have gotten if she'd asked too many questions about why I specifically wanted that year, that hospital, that name. I figured something was up the second you asked for that exact date range without a project ticket attached, she told me over coffee weeks later. I wasn't about to make you explain yourself in the middle of the break room. Figured whatever you were looking for, you'd tell me when you were ready. She'd quietly greenlit my access on her own authority and never once brought it up until I brought it up first. You could have gotten written up for that, I told her. She just shrugged, stirring her coffee. Some things are worth a write-up, long as you found what you needed. It wasn't the confrontation in Colette's kitchen that actually cracked this case open, if I'm honest. It was one coworker deciding to trust me with a shortcut weeks before I even understood what I was going to do with it. Julian took it about as hard as you'd expect. Worse, actually. He didn't speak to his mother for almost a month, and when he finally did, it wasn't the reunion she was probably hoping for. He told me later he kept picturing his whole childhood on a kind of split screen, the version he remembered living, and the version that had actually happened underneath it, running the whole time without him knowing. The christening got postponed, not canceled, just moved quietly to a smaller date with fewer people, which honestly felt like the only honest thing left to do given everything. The trust is still sitting in Raleigh, last I heard now formally reopened under Julian's actual legal name and lineage, working its way through paperwork. That'll probably take another year to untangle completely. He hasn't decided yet what he wants to do with it. Some days he says he doesn't want a dime of money tied to a woman he never got to know. Other days he says it feels like the only thing he has left that actually belonged to her. Here's where I actually am with all of this now. I don't hate Colette the way I thought I would in that kitchen. I hate the decision she made and kept making year after year every single time she had a chance to say something and chose not to. That part hasn't softened at all. But I understand the fear underneath it in a way that makes it heavier, not lighter. She wasn't some cartoon villain. She was a scared young woman who held a dying stranger's baby for 4 days and decided one silence at a time that keeping him meant never letting the truth catch up. I still slip sometimes. Just last week on the phone, I caught myself halfway through saying, "Okay, Mom, talk soon," before I stopped the word just hanging there unfinished, the same way her sentences used to hang in the air at Sunday dinner. 10 years of habit doesn't turn off just because the facts underneath it changed. I don't know what to call her yet. Colette feels too formal for someone who taught me her biscuit recipe. Mom feels like it belongs to someone else now, someone I never got to meet. So for now, most days I just don't call her anything at all. I say what I need to say, and I let the silence sit where the word used to go, and some days that feels like enough, and some days it really, really doesn't. Our daughter is too young to notice the difference yet. She just knows there's a woman who shows up with cookies and calls her sugar and lets her stay up 10 minutes past bedtime. Maybe by the time she's old enough to ask questions, I'll actually have an answer ready. I don't have one yet. I'm not going to lie about that part either. I'm holding a chart that's been sealed for 31 years when I finally understand what I'm looking at. My hands are steady. They're trained to be. It's literally my job, but my stomach isn't. The hospital stamp on the intake form doesn't match the framed birth certificate hanging in my mother-in-law's hallway. Not by 2 years. Not by a typo. By an entirely different mother's name. 3 days before my daughter's christening, where Colette is set to stand up in front of 200 people, as the only living grandmother, I'm sitting in a records room with proof that the woman I've called Mom for 10 years isn't my husband's biological mother at all. I'm Maya. I'm 34. And this is the story of the decade-long lie that almost got a blessing said over it in a church in front of everyone we know before I ever found out it was one. Our house sits on a quiet cul-de-sac outside the city, the kind of street where everybody waves from their driveway and nobody locks their front door. Julian built our daughter's crib himself, took him a whole weekend and 2 trips to the hardware store for the right screws. Most nights it's just us, a stack of dishes in the sink, and the low hum of the dishwasher running while we half-watch something on TV. I would have told you without hesitation that this family, the one Colette had built around us, was the safest thing I had. I work in health information management at a regional hospital outside Charlotte. Basically, I'm the person who keeps 30 years of paper charts from turning into chaos when a hospital finally goes digital. It's not glamorous. It's cross-referencing, spotting when a date doesn't match, catching the kind of small clerical inconsistency that most people would scroll right past. I'm good at it. I've caught insurance discrepancies that saved the hospital real money just by noticing when 2 versions of the same story didn't quite line up. I never once thought I'd use that skill on my own family. Julian and I had been married 10 years, together 12. He's steady funny in a dry way, the kind of guy who reads the instructions before he builds anything, which honestly, after everything, might have been the thing I loved most about him. He wasn't a liar, not on purpose. He just never asked the questions I was about to start asking. His mom, Colette, was the reason I actually looked forward to holidays. My own mother died when I was 19, and for a long time after that, family gathering meant a knot in my chest. Colette changed that. She taught me to make her mother's biscuit recipe. She called me my girl at every family dinner out loud in front of everyone like it wasn't even a question. Julian's biological mom, Diane, had died young. That's the story I'd been told since the day I met this family, and Colette had stepped in and raised him alone from the time he was small. I loved her. I want that on the record before I say anything else because it matters for everything that comes after. This isn't a story about hating a villain from the start. It's a story about a woman I trusted completely, who let me trust her completely for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with what she stood to lose. The first crack showed up 8 months before the christening, and I almost missed it entirely. I was going through old photo albums at Colette's house pulling pictures for a slideshow at Julian's 40th birthday party, and I found one from what should have been the year he was born. Colette maybe 22, 23 in the photo holding a newborn on a hospital bed. I did the math without even meaning to. It's just how my brain works now after years of matching dates for a living. If that photo was really from Julian's birth, Colette would have had him at 19. She'd always said she had him at 26. I told myself it was probably just a mislabeled photo. Old photo albums are full of mistakes like that wrong year written on the back, pictures shuffled out of order over decades of moves. I put it back in the box and didn't bring it up. Except, I kept thinking about it. I flipped past a dozen other photos looking for the same year, the same hospital room, anything to explain it away, and I couldn't find a single other picture from Julian's actual infancy at all. No hospital photos, no baby's first week shots, nothing between that one mismatched picture and a toddler already walking. For a woman who scrapbooked everything who'd made me an entire album for our wedding within a month, that gap felt like the loudest thing in the box. Not that week. Not for a long time after, honestly. I had a toddler, a full-time job, a husband who worked long hours, and a mother-in-law who'd never once given me a reason to go digging. So I didn't dig. I told myself there'd be a better, calmer moment to ask, and there wasn't. There rarely is. There's just the moment you finally run out of reasons to keep looking away. The complicating moment came a few weeks later at Sunday dinner when Colette stood up with a glass of sweet tea like it was champagne, and gave one of her toasts the kind she was famous for in that family. "Family is what you build," she said, looking right at me, "not just what you're born into." I learned that the hard way, and I've never once regretted it. Everyone raised a glass. I raised mine too and meant it because in that moment, I still believed she was talking about grief about losing Julian's father years back, about choosing to hold this family together anyway. I had no idea yet how literally true that sentence was, or how much it was actually about her, and not about anyone she'd lost. The escalation didn't start with a plan. It started with a project at work. Our archive room smells the way every hospital basement does: cold paper and old cardboard, that particular dust that gets into the back of your throat by hour 2. I'd spent 3 straight days in there before February even got interesting scanning intake forms into a database, one banker's box at a time, half listening to a podcast just to keep my brain from going numb. Our hospital had been slowly digitizing 30-plus years of paper obstetrics records. And in February, my department got assigned the archive boxes from the exact decade Julian would have been born, in a totally unrelated coincidence that, looking back, feels like the universe just deciding I'd waited long enough. I wasn't even looking for anything. I was doing my actual job, scanning intake charts into a database matching names against old insurance claims. And then a name came up that stopped me cold: Diane Whitfield. Same last name Colette had always used for Julian's mother, who passed young. Same birth year the family always quoted for her. Except the chart said Diane Whitfield had given birth to a healthy baby boy on the exact date the family always celebrated as Julian's birthday, 3 years after the year Colette claimed she'd had him. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I had to alone at my desk at 11 in the morning on a Tuesday, staring at a sealed medical chart with my mother-in-law's maiden name nowhere on it. I didn't tell Julian that day. I didn't tell anyone. I photographed the chart number, logged out, and drove home in complete silence, replaying every biscuit recipe, every my girl, every Sunday dinner toast, wondering how much of it had been real and how much had been a decade-long performance for an audience that never knew there was a script. I didn't go inside right away that evening either. I stood on our own front porch for a few minutes, first watching Julian through the kitchen window, making our daughter's dinner, completely unaware that the woman he'd married had just spent the afternoon reading his real mother's death file. I need you to understand something before I keep going, because it matters for everything after this. I didn't start pulling records because I stopped loving Colette. I started because I couldn't stop loving her enough to need to know the truth. Those aren't the same thing, and it took me weeks to understand the difference myself. For the next several weeks, I lived 2 lives at once, which is an exhausting, lonely way to exist. I went to work, scanned charts, made small talk in the break room. I came home, helped with homework, sat through Sunday dinners at Colette's table, laughing at her stories like nothing had changed, while quietly building a timeline in a notebook I kept locked in my car's glove compartment so Julian wouldn't stumble across it by accident. I pulled Diane Whitfield's full obstetrics file, using my hospital access completely within my job technically, since it was part of the digitization project, though I'll admit I was reading it with a different set of eyes than the project required. What I found stopped me for good. Diane had died 4 days after delivery complications from a hemorrhage the hospital notes described in clinical flat language that somehow made it worse. Julian's father had been listed as the baby's father. And in the very last note in the file, a discharge summary mentioned a family arrangement for the infant's care, with almost no detail beyond that, the kind of vague, careful language that tells you someone somewhere wanted this handled quietly. I called the county vital records office the next week, using my professional credentials to request archived records, something I've done 100 times for legitimate hospital business, and something that for the first time felt like it might blow my whole life open. I sat in the parking lot outside the records building for almost 15 minutes before I went in. Engine off, radio off, just watching people go in and out with folders under their arms, none of them carrying anything close to what I was about to walk out with. I wasn't scared exactly. I wanted to be completely sure before I let this happen.